You know that feeling when you walk past an empty lot in the city and something about it just feels wrong? Like the air is different there, heavier somehow, even though you can't explain why. There's a place like that in Chicago, a massive stretch of land that used to hold something extraordinary, something that shaped the childhoods of millions. And the way it disappeared, the speed of it, the completeness of it, has left questions that still haven't been answered, even after more than 50 years. We're talking about Riverview Park, and if you haven't heard of it, that's part of the problem. Because Riverview wasn't just any amusement park. For 70 years, it was the largest amusement park in the United States. 70 years. Think about that. From 1904 to 1967, generation after generation of Chicago families poured through those gates. It was bigger than Disneyland at its peak. It had more rides, more visitors, more everything. And then, one day in 1967, the owners simply announced it was closing. Immediately. No farewell season, no final summer, no chance for people to say goodbye to a place that had been woven into the fabric of their lives since the turn of the century. The official reason? The land was worth more than the business. Simple economics, they said. Clean and rational. But here's what doesn't make sense. The park was still profitable. It was still drawing massive crowds. The rides were still running. And then, almost overnight, it was gone. Demolished so quickly that people who worked there barely had time to collect their belongings. Within months, the bulldozers had erased what took 7 decades to build. Now, you might think this is just a story about real estate and business decisions. And maybe it is. But there are layers here, patterns that emerge when you start looking closely, things that don't quite add up the way they should. Because Riverview's story doesn't begin with its closing. It begins much earlier, with the kind of accidents that people whispered about, the kind of incidents that got buried in newspaper back pages, the kind of history that a city might prefer to forget. Let me take you back to the beginning, because understanding what happened in 1967 requires understanding what Riverview actually was. The park opened in 1904, built by the Sharpshooters Association on 74 acres of land along the Chicago River's North Branch. Think about Chicago in 1904. The World's Fair had just happened the year before. The city was exploding with innovation, with ambition, with this raw industrial energy that was transforming America. And into this moment came Riverview, a pleasure ground that would become, for generations, the defining entertainment experience of the Midwest. The entrance alone was designed to overwhelm you. A massive facade of lights and architectural flourishes, towers and spires that you could see from blocks away. Once you passed through those gates, you entered another world. Not the sanitized, corporate-controlled theme park experience we know today, but something wilder, more chaotic, more genuinely thrilling because it felt genuinely dangerous. And here's where the story starts to get complicated, because Riverview was dangerous. Not just in the thrilling roller coaster drop way that amusement parks are supposed to be dangerous. Actually, dangerous. The park's most famous ride, the one that defined its identity for decades, was called the Bobs. It opened in 1924, and if you talk to anyone who rode it, their eyes still light up with a mixture of excitement and something else, something darker. The Bobs wasn't the tallest roller coaster or the fastest, but it was violent. That's the word people use, violent. The drops were designed to create negative G-forces that would literally lift you out of your seat. The turns were so sharp and sudden that riders would be thrown against each other, against the sides of the cars. People came off that ride with bruises, with whiplash, with injuries that today would shut a park down permanently. But here's what's interesting. People loved it for exactly that reason. The danger was the appeal. Riverview's slogan was "Laugh your troubles away," but the park's real draw was the edge of genuine peril that ran through everything. This wasn't simulated danger. This was actual risk that you could feel in your bones. Now, the park owners, the Schmidt family, who took over operation in the 1900s, they knew this. They understood that the thrill came from the authentic possibility of harm. So they pushed boundaries that would be unthinkable today. Rides were built bigger, faster, more intense than safety standards probably should have allowed. Because in the early and mid-20th century, those standards barely existed, and people did get hurt. Not occasionally, regularly. The injuries were part of the Riverview experience, woven into its folklore. Broken bones from the bobs, concussions from the wild mouse. Every summer brought new stories, new accidents, new reasons to wonder if maybe this particular thrill wasn't worth the cost. But the park kept running, the rides kept operating, and the crowds kept coming. Here's where we need to pause and consider something, because there's a question forming that we're going to return to again and again. How many people were actually hurt at Riverview? Not the minor bumps and bruises, but the serious injuries, the life-changing ones, the ones that ended in tragedy. The answer is, we don't fully know. And that's strange, isn't it? For a park that operated for 70 years, that entertained millions upon millions of people, the historical record of injuries and deaths is surprisingly incomplete, fragmentary, as if pieces of the story were deliberately left out or allowed to fade into obscurity. What we do know comes from newspaper reports, from oral histories, from the memories of people who were there, and those sources tell us that Riverview had a body count. The question is, how high that count actually was. The most well-documented incident happened in 1948 on a ride called the Fireball. 6 people died when 2 cars collided. 6 people, in a single accident. The ride had a mechanical failure, a brake system that didn't engage when it should have, and the result was catastrophic. The park shut down temporarily. Investigations were conducted, and then Riverview reopened, because it always reopened. But there were others. A boy fell from the Shoot the Chutes water ride in the 1920s and drowned. Multiple people were killed on the bobs over the years, though exact numbers are disputed. There were deaths on the flying turns, on the Greyhound coaster, on rides whose names most people have forgotten but whose accidents left permanent marks on the families involved. And here's what's unsettling about these incidents. They didn't stop people from coming. If anything, Riverview's popularity continued to grow right through its most dangerous years. The accidents became part of its mythology, proof of its authenticity, evidence that this wasn't some tamed corporate entertainment product, but a real place where real things happened. You have to understand the psychology of this. We're talking about an era before litigation culture fully took hold, before safety became the paramount concern it is today. People accepted risk differently. They understood that fun and danger existed on a spectrum, and Riverview occupied the far end of that spectrum by design. But there's accepting risk. And then there's what happened at Riverview. Because as the decades progressed, as the park aged and the rides got older, something started to shift. The accidents that used to seem like unfortunate but unavoidable incidents began to feel like something else, like warnings maybe, or symptoms of a deeper problem that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The rides at Riverview weren't being replaced or significantly updated. The Bob's was still running in the 1960s, exactly as it had been running in the 1920s. Same track, same structure, same violent intensity. Except now it was 40 years older, 40 years more worn, 40 years more likely to have stress fractures and metal fatigue and all the invisible deteriorations that time inflicts on structures never meant to last this long. The park management had to know this. They had to see the maintenance costs rising. Had to understand that keeping these aging rides operational was becoming more expensive and more dangerous every year. But Riverview's identity was built on these attractions. The Bob's wasn't just a ride. It was the ride, the centerpiece of the entire park's reputation. You couldn't remove it without fundamentally changing what Riverview was. So they kept it running. All of them. The parachutes, which lifted riders 150 feet in the air and dropped them on cables that sometimes didn't slow the descent as smoothly as they should have. The rotor, which spun people against a wall so fast that the floor could drop away beneath them, subjecting their bodies to forces that occasionally caused people to black out. The silver flash, the flying turns, ride after ride that was essentially a museum piece, a historical artifact, still operating at full capacity, still subjecting thousands of people every day to stresses these machines were never designed to withstand indefinitely. And the strange thing is, we have evidence that park management was aware of the risks. Internal documents from the 1950s and 1960s, the few that survived, show discussions about safety concerns, about the rising cost of insurance, about injuries that were becoming harder to dismiss or conceal. The Schmidt family wasn't oblivious. They knew they were operating on borrowed time, that eventually something would happen that would force a reckoning. What we don't know is whether they understood just how close that reckoning was or what form it would ultimately take. Now let's talk about what was happening around Riverview in the years leading up to its closure, because the park didn't exist in isolation. Chicago itself was changing in ways that would prove crucial to understanding the end. The neighborhood around Riverview, the North Side Industrial Corridor where the park had thrived for decades, was transforming. The industries that had once filled the area with workers and families were declining, moving out, shutting down. The demographic makeup of the neighborhood was shifting. Crime rates were rising. The city itself was experiencing the same urban decay that was affecting industrial cities across America in the 1960s. And Riverview, this massive piece of real estate occupying 74 prime acres, was sitting right in the middle of this transformation. The land beneath the roller coasters and fun houses was becoming more valuable than the entertainment taking place on top of it. This is the official explanation for the closure, and it's not wrong, but it's incomplete, because here's what makes the closure so abrupt and strange. The announcement came in October 1967, right at the end of the season. The park had just completed what was, by most accounts, a successful summer. Attendance was down from its peak in the 1950s, yes, but it was still drawing substantial crowds. The park was still making money, and then, suddenly, it was over. The owners announced that Riverview would not reopen the following spring. No transition period, no phased closure, no attempt to extract maximum value from a final farewell season. Just done. The employees found out from the newspaper. People who had worked at Riverview for 30, 40 years learned that their jobs were gone when they opened the Chicago Tribune. The city was shocked. Families were devastated. And then, before anyone could really process what was happening, the demolition began. This is where the story takes on this quality of erasure, of something being removed, not just physically, but from memory itself. The demolition of Riverview wasn't gradual or sentimental. It was systematic and ruthless. Within 6 months, virtually everything was gone. The Bob's, which had been an architectural landmark visible across the North Side, was reduced to scrap metal. The parachutes, the funhouse, the midway, all of it torn down with an efficiency that seemed almost aggressive in its thoroughness. And here's what people noticed at the time. There was no attempt to preserve anything, no museum pieces, no historical archive of rides or structures or even photographs beyond what individuals happened to have saved. The park's own records were largely destroyed or lost. It was as if the owners wanted to ensure that Riverview couldn't be reconstructed or remembered in any official capacity. Now you could argue this was just practical business. Once the decision was made to close, why drag it out? Why spend money maintaining a property that was about to be redeveloped? That's rational. That makes sense. Except for one thing, the land sat empty for years afterward. The expected development didn't materialize immediately. The site just remained vacant, a massive empty lot where one of America's most famous amusement parks used to stand. And in that emptiness, stories started to circulate. People who lived nearby reported strange things, sounds at night that seemed to come from rides that were no longer there. The rhythmic clicking of a roller coaster chain lift, the screams of riders, the carnival music that had been Riverview's constant soundtrack for 7 decades. These reports were dismissed as imagination, nostalgia manifesting as auditory hallucination, but they persisted. And here's where we have to make a choice about how to think about this story, because there are 2 ways to understand what happened to Riverview, and they're not mutually exclusive, but they require different frameworks of interpretation. The first framework is purely material and economic. Riverview closed because the economics no longer made sense. The rides were aging and dangerous, insurance costs were rising, the neighborhood was declining, and the land was worth more redeveloped. The speed of the closure and demolition was simply the owners cutting their losses and moving on. The strange reports afterward are just nostalgia and urban legend, the way any beloved place gets mythologized after it's gone. This explanation is clean and rational, It accounts for most of the known facts, and it's probably true as far as it goes. But there's a second framework, one that emerges when you look at the details that don't quite fit the economic narrative. When you consider how many people died or were seriously injured at Riverview over 70 years, when you think about the rides that probably should have been shut down years before they were, but kept operating because they were too central to the park's identity to remove, when you notice how quickly and completely the place was erased, as if there was urgency beyond simple business efficiency. This second framework asks, what if the closure wasn't entirely voluntary? What if something happened or was about to happen that forced the owner's hand in a way they couldn't publicly acknowledge? Now let me be clear. There's no smoking gun here, no definitive evidence of a cover-up or hidden scandal, but there are suggestions, hints, patterns in the historical record that point toward something more complicated than the official story. Start with the timing. October 1967. Why then, specifically? The park had survived worse years financially. It had weathered the Great Depression, World War II, the economic uncertainties of the 1950s. What made 1967 the breaking point? One possibility that's been suggested by researchers and former employees is that insurance companies were preparing to drop Riverview's coverage entirely. The park's safety record, combined with the aging infrastructure, may have made it uninsurable at any price the owners were willing to pay, and without insurance, the park couldn't legally operate. But there's no public record of this. No insurance company publicly refused coverage. No regulatory agency issued a shutdown order. If this was the trigger, it happened behind closed doors, in conversations that were never documented or were deliberately kept private. Another possibility, darker and more speculative, is that there was an incident in the final season that never made it into public record. Not necessarily a death, but perhaps an injury serious enough or circumstances unusual enough that it threatened to expose the full extent of Riverview's safety compromises. An accident that would have triggered investigations, lawsuits, media scrutiny that the owners simply couldn't afford. The problem with investigating this theory is that by the time researchers started looking for answers, most of the people who would have known the truth were dead. The Schmidt family sold off their interests and largely disappeared from public life. The employees scattered. The records were destroyed. It's as if a deliberate wall of silence descended around the circumstances of the closure. And maybe that's not suspicious at all. Maybe it's just what happens when a business closes and people move on. But the completeness of it, the totality of the erasure, feels intentional in a way that's hard to shake. Let's consider what we know about the final days of operation. Eyewitness accounts from that last season describe a park that felt different. Rides breaking down more frequently. Maintenance crews that seemed overwhelmed. A sense of decay that had moved beyond charming vintage atmosphere into something that felt genuinely neglected. One former ride operator interviewed decades later described a culture of quick fixes and deferred maintenance. Problems that should have taken rides offline for days or weeks were being patched temporarily to keep things running. Safety checks that should have been routine were being rushed or skipped entirely. The park was being held together, barely, by people who knew it couldn't last but had no choice except to keep going until someone made the decision to stop. And here's what's chilling about that description. It suggests that everyone involved knew disaster was approaching, not as an abstract possibility, but as an inevitable outcome if things continued. The question wasn't whether something catastrophic would eventually happen, but when. Did the owners close Riverview to prevent that disaster? Did they look at the aging rides and the mounting risks and make a calculation that it was better to shut down voluntarily than wait for tragedy to force their hand? If so, that would actually be the responsible choice. But it's not the story they told. The story they told was about real estate values and business decisions, with no mention of safety concerns or preventing potential catastrophe. Why hide that motive if it was actually the reason? Unless the truth was worse than they wanted to admit. Unless acknowledging the safety issues would have opened them up to liability for all the years they'd operated knowing the risks. Unless stopping before disaster struck was legally safer than admitting they saw it coming. This is speculation, but it's informed speculation based on patterns in how institutions handle risk and liability. and it points toward a version of events where the closure of Riverview wasn't primarily about economics, but about something more urgent and more dangerous that the owners needed to contain. Now, let's talk about what happened to the land after Riverview closed, because this is where the practical and the strange start to blur together in ways that are hard to dismiss. The site sat vacant for years, as I mentioned. Eventually, in the 1970s, development began. Part of the land became a DeVry Technical Institute campus. Other portions were converted to light industrial use. None of it particularly notable or unusual, just standard urban redevelopment. But construction workers on these projects reported things, equipment malfunctions that seemed to cluster in specific areas of the site, foundations that wouldn't set properly, as if the ground itself was unstable in ways that engineering surveys hadn't predicted. And yes, the continuation of those strange sounds, especially at night, especially in the areas where the most intense rides used to operate. Again, you can explain all of this rationally. Old construction sites have contamination issues, ground instability, all sorts of material problems. Workers on any large project tell stories. It's human nature to find patterns and meaning in random events. But here's what's harder to explain. The number of businesses that opened on the Riverview site and then failed relatively quickly. The DeVry campus eventually moved. The industrial facilities changed hands repeatedly. Nothing seemed to stick. The land that was supposedly so valuable that it justified closing Chicago's most beloved amusement park couldn't seem to support successful long-term development. You start to wonder if maybe the land wasn't as valuable as the official story suggested, or if there was something about the site itself, something material or psychological or historical, that made it difficult to build on successfully. And then there are the people who worked at Riverview, the ones who survived into the modern era, and what they've said about the closure when pressed. Most of them stick to the official story: economics, real estate, inevitable business decision. But some, in unguarded moments, have suggested there was more to it. Nothing specific, nothing that rises to the level of evidence, but a sense that the closure happened for reasons beyond what was publicly stated, that there were secrets, dangers, incidents that never made it into official record. One former maintenance worker, in an oral history interview from the 1990s, said something that stuck with researchers. He said, "They closed it just in time." When asked what he meant, he became vague, said he probably shouldn't talk about it, that it was all in the past anyway. But that phrase, just in time, as if disaster was avoided by days or weeks, not years. What was he referring to? We don't know. He died before anyone could follow up. And that's the pattern with Riverview. Just when you think you're about to learn something definitive, the trail goes cold. The person who knew is gone, the record is lost, the story disappears back into the murk of history. Let me take you deeper into the specific rides and what made them so dangerous, because understanding the mechanical reality of Riverview helps illuminate why the closure might have been more urgent than the official story suggests. The Bob's, which I've mentioned several times, was genuinely an engineering marvel of its era. Built by the legendary designer Fred Church, it was constructed from wood. Millions of board feet of lumber shaped into this massive skeletal structure. And wood, unlike steel, is organic. It flexes, it warps, it develops stress cracks, it rots. Maintaining a wooden roller coaster is a constant battle against entropy. By the 1960s, the Bob's was nearly 40 years old. Sections of track had been replaced over the years, but the core structure was original. And here's what matters. Wooden coasters need to be inspected constantly, boards replaced proactively before they fail. It's labor-intensive and expensive. If you defer that maintenance, if you let it slide for even a season or two, you're creating conditions for catastrophic failure. We know from worker accounts that maintenance at Riverview was stretched thin in the final years. Not enough people, not enough budget, too many rides needing too much work. Decisions were being made about which problems to address and which to ignore or temporarily patch. That's a dangerous situation on any ride, but on something like the Bob's, it's potentially deadly. And the Bob's wasn't the only concern. The parachute ride, which lifted people high in the air and dropped them, relied on cables and mechanical brake systems that needed perfect calibration. Any wear in the cables, any degradation in the braking mechanism, and you're looking at people falling without adequate deceleration. That's not a malfunction that results in minor injuries. That's the kind of failure that kills people. The park operated dozens of rides, many of them with similar maintenance demands and similar potential for catastrophic failure if something went wrong. Managing that portfolio of risk, especially as the equipment aged and budgets tightened, would have required constant vigilance and significant investment. If either of those elements faltered, disaster became increasingly likely. So when we talk about the closure being potentially motivated by safety concerns, we're not talking about abstract worries. We're talking about specific identifiable points of failure that could have resulted in deaths on a scale that would have ended Riverview anyway, but with massive legal and financial consequences for the owners. Closing preemptively, before that failure occurred, makes sense from a liability standpoint. But again, if that was the motive, why not say so? Why frame it purely as an economic decision about land values? The answer might be that admitting safety concerns would have raised questions about all the years of operation before the closure. If the rides were too dangerous to operate in 1967, when did they become dangerous? Were they dangerous in 1966, 1965? How far back did the negligence extend? Acknowledging the safety issues as the reason for closure could have exposed the owners to massive liability for past operations. Better, from their perspective, to frame it as a simple business decision. Clean, emotionless, no admission of wrongdoing or deferred maintenance or prioritizing profits over safety. Just economics. But economics doesn't explain the speed of the demolition. It doesn't explain why a park that was still drawing substantial crowds couldn't find a buyer who might have invested in safety upgrades and continued operation. It doesn't explain the complete erasure of records and historical materials. Something else was happening. Something that required not just closing the park, but erasing it as quickly and thoroughly as possible. Now let's talk about the other side of this story, the human dimension. Because Riverview wasn't just rides and real estate. It was central to the identity and memory of millions of people. For generations of Chicago families, Riverview was where you went for birthdays, graduations, dates, family outings. It was woven into the social fabric of the city in a way that's hard to overstate. When it closed, it wasn't just an amusement park shutting down. It was the loss of a communal space, a shared reference point, a piece of collective identity. The mourning was real and profound. People wept when the closure was announced. Newspapers ran editorials about the end of an era. There were calls for the city to intervene, to purchase the park and keep it running as a public amenity. None of that happened. And here's what's psychologically interesting. For many people who grew up with Riverview, the memories have taken on a quality that transcends normal nostalgia. The park has become mythologized in a way that goes beyond its actual historical reality. People remember it as more thrilling, more dangerous, more vivid than it probably actually was. This is partly just how memory works. We amplify the past, especially childhood experiences, making them larger and more significant than they were. But with Riverview, there's an additional layer. The sudden, complete disappearance created a kind of wound in the collective memory. The park was there, and then it wasn't, with no transition, no gradual fading. That abruptness seems to have intensified the mythology that grew up around it. And within that mythology, there are persistent stories that hint at darker truths. Stories about rides that were shut down after particularly gruesome accidents, only to be reopened under different names. Stories about workers who disappeared and were never found, supposedly lost in the labyrinthine infrastructure beneath the park. Stories about the tunnel system that connected various parts of Riverview. Tunnels that some claim were used to quietly remove bodies or dispose of evidence from accidents the park didn't want publicized. Now, some of this is clearly urban legend, the kind of folklore that accumulates around any large, mysterious place. But the interesting thing about urban legends is that they often contain kernels of truth, actual events that get exaggerated and mythologized over time. Did Riverview have a tunnel system? Yes, absolutely. The park needed infrastructure for utilities, for moving supplies, for allowing staff to travel between areas without crossing through the public spaces. Those tunnels existed. Did the park sometimes downplay or cover up accidents? Almost certainly. In an era before modern liability law and aggressive media scrutiny, it would have been relatively easy to minimize incidents, pay off families quietly, ensure that not every injury or death made it into public record. How far did that cover-up extend? That's where we move from documented history into speculation. But the complete absence of comprehensive safety records, the fragmentary nature of the historical documentation, suggests that the park's official account of its own safety history was, at minimum, incomplete. And here's where the paranormal stories start to intersect with the material reality in ways that are hard to completely dismiss. Because what are hauntings, really, if not the persistence of traumatic events in collective memory? The sounds of rides that no longer exist, the feelings of unease on the empty land, the sense that something terrible happened there and left a mark that ordinary time hasn't fully erased. You don't have to believe in literal ghosts to recognize that places can carry the weight of their own history. Trauma embeds itself in space, in memory, in the stories people tell. And Riverview, whatever else it was a place where genuine trauma occurred repeatedly over decades. So when people report feeling uneasy on the site, when construction workers describe strange experiences, when the land seems to resist successful development, maybe that's not supernatural. Maybe it's just the material reality of trying to build on ground that's saturated with difficult history, with memories of pain and loss that the community hasn't fully processed because they were never fully acknowledged. The closure of Riverview was presented as the end of a story. But in many ways it was just the beginning of a different story, one about erasure and memory, about the gap between official narratives and lived experience, about how we decide which parts of our history to preserve and which to demolish as quickly as possible. The DeVry campus that was built on part of the site has since moved and been demolished. The industrial facilities have changed hands again. Today, much of the Riverview land is a police evidence storage facility and a waste management company. Not exactly the vibrant redevelopment that supposedly justified closing Chicago's most beloved amusement park. You start to wonder if maybe the closure was never really about maximizing the value of the land. Maybe it was about removing a liability, ending a dangerous situation before it became catastrophic, and doing so in a way that minimized legal exposure and public scrutiny. And maybe, just maybe, there were specific reasons why that removal needed to happen quickly, completely, and without preserving any evidence that might complicate the simple narrative of economic inevitability. Let me walk you through what we actually know versus what we can only infer, because I want to be clear about where the documented history ends and speculation begins. Documented facts. Riverview operated from 1904 to 1967. It was the largest amusement park in the United States at its peak. Multiple people died there in accidents over the decades, with the 1948 fireball incident killing 6 being the most catastrophic single event. The park closed suddenly in October 1967 with minimal notice. It was demolished rapidly and thoroughly. The land has had troubled development history since. What we can reasonably infer, the park's aging infrastructure created increasing safety risks in its final years. Maintenance was likely deferred or inadequate to fully address these risks. The closure timing suggests something more urgent than simple long-term business planning. The speed and completeness of the demolition suggests a desire to foreclose certain possibilities, whether investigation, preservation, or continued operation under new ownership. What remains speculative but suggested by available evidence, there may have been safety issues or incidents in the final season that were not publicly disclosed. The closure may have been driven primarily by liability concerns rather than real estate economics. There may have been deliberate destruction of records to prevent future liability or historical accounting of safety issues. What is purely speculative, unsupported by hard evidence, specific cover-ups of deaths or disappearances, paranormal activity or hauntings, intentional harm or criminality beyond ordinary business negligence. This is important because the story of Riverview operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and confusion between these levels can distort our understanding. On one level, it's a straightforward business story. An amusement park closed because the economics changed and the land became more valuable redeveloped. Simple. On another level, it's a safety and liability story. Aging rides, deferred maintenance, increasing risks, and owners making calculated decisions to limit their exposure. More complex, but still basically rational. On a third level, it's a story about collective trauma and memory. A beloved place disappearing suddenly, leaving psychological wounds that manifest as urban legends and haunting stories. This is real even if ghosts aren't. And on a fourth level, there's the possibility of deeper secrets. Incidents that were covered up, decisions that were made to protect the owners at the expense of full historical accounting, truths that remain buried because the people who knew them are dead and the records are destroyed. All of these levels are simultaneously true to different degrees. The trick is holding them in mind at once without collapsing into either pure rationalism that dismisses anything that can't be documented or pure speculation that treats every rumor as fact. What I keep coming back to is the speed, the suddenness, the completeness of the erasure. Because even allowing for all the rational business explanations, there's something about the way Riverview ended that feels like panic. Like someone making decisions quickly, perhaps too quickly, to prevent something worse from happening. And that something worse might have been purely financial, a lawsuit, or insurance cancellation, or regulatory action. But it might also have been more immediate, an accident waiting to happen, a failure mode that someone in authority recognized and couldn't allow to occur. If you're operating rides that you know are on the edge of catastrophic failure, and you make the decision to close before that failure occurs, you're actually making the responsible choice. But you can't admit that's why you're closing, because that admission exposes you to liability for operating those rides while knowing the risks. So you frame it as economics. You demolish quickly to prevent investigation. You destroy records to prevent historical reconstruction of the decision-making process. And you hope that time and fading memory will eventually obscure the truth enough that it doesn't matter anymore. Is that what happened? We can't know for certain. But it fits the pattern of evidence better than the simple story of real estate values trumping sentimental attachment. Let's talk about one more dimension of this story, the workers. The people who operated the rides, maintained the equipment, cleaned up the messes, dealt with the injuries. Because their perspective, the little we have of it, offers crucial insights into what was really happening in Riverview's final years. These weren't corporate employees with HR departments and formal safety protocols. Many of them were seasonal workers, teenagers and young adults working summer jobs. The permanent staff was small and overstretched. It was, by most accounts, a fairly chaotic work environment where people learned on the job and improvised solutions to problems because there wasn't time or budget for proper fixes. In that kind of environment, you develop a culture of making do, of taking risks, because the alternative is shutting down and disappointing thousands of paying customers. You normalize conditions that, from an outside perspective, would seem obviously dangerous. Several former workers in the years since the closure have described this culture. The sense that they were always running rides that probably weren't quite safe enough. But what could you do? Stop the ride every time something seemed off. You'd never operate. So you developed judgment about which problems were serious and which you could ignore, at least until the end of the day. That's a recipe for disaster, obviously. It's also a recipe for workers carrying enormous guilt if something catastrophic eventually happened or nearly happened. And some of the fragmentary accounts we have suggest that's exactly what occurred. Workers who felt, looking back, that they'd been complicit in something dangerous, even if they were just following the culture and expectations of the workplace. One maintenance worker, speaking anonymously decades later, described being told to do a quick patch on a structural issue that really needed major repair. He pushed back, said it wasn't safe. He was told to do it anyway or quit. He did the patch. The ride operated for the rest of the season. Nothing happened. No accident. No failure. But he never forgot the feeling of compromising his judgment, of being forced to prioritize operations over safety. How many stories like that are buried in Riverview's history? How many workers made choices they weren't comfortable with because the alternative was losing their job or shutting down the park? How many near misses occurred that never made it into any official record because they didn't quite cross the threshold into disaster? This is the human dimension of institutional risk. It's not abstract probabilities. It's individuals making decisions under pressure, with incomplete information, in a culture that values certain outcomes over others. And when that culture prioritizes keeping rides running over fixing problems, eventually something breaks. The question is whether something broke at Riverview in a way that forced the closure, or whether the closure happened just before the break occurred. Either way, the workers who were there carry pieces of the truth that will die with them. And that brings us to the final dimension of this story, what Riverview represents in the broader context of how we think about risk, safety, and entertainment. Amusement parks have always existed in this strange space where we deliberately seek out experiences that simulate danger. We want to feel like we might die, while trusting absolutely that we won't. That contract between park operators and visitors depends on the danger being entirely controlled, entirely illusory. But Riverview belonged to an era when that contract was more ambiguous. The danger wasn't entirely illusory. The risk was real, even if small. And that reality was, to some extent, part of the appeal. We've moved away from that model almost entirely. Modern amusement parks are ruthlessly safe, engineered to tolerances that make catastrophic failure nearly impossible. The thrill is entirely synthetic, created by forces and speeds that feel extreme but are actually carefully controlled. You could argue we've lost something in that transition. That authentic thrill, the one that comes from actual risk, is fundamentally different from simulated thrill. It engages different parts of the brain, creates different memories, means something different psychologically. But we've also gained something. We've gained the ability to trust that our entertainment won't actually hurt us, that the fun doesn't come with a real possibility of trauma or death. Riverview existed in the transition between these two eras. It was built in the first era, when real risk was acceptable, even desirable. It closed at the beginning of the second era, when liability and safety culture were making that model untenable. And maybe that's the real story of the closure. Not a specific disaster or cover-up, but simply the recognition that Riverview's entire operating philosophy, its identity as a place of authentic danger, couldn't survive into the modern world. The rides would need to be completely redesigned, the entire culture of the park transformed to meet emerging safety standards. At which point it wouldn't be Riverview anymore. It would be something else, something safer and less thrilling and fundamentally different. So maybe the choice was between that transformation or complete closure, and the owners chose closure because at least that preserved the memory of what Riverview actually was. That's a more generous interpretation than some of what I've suggested earlier. But it might also be closer to the emotional truth, even if it doesn't fully explain the speed and thoroughness of the demolition. The reality is probably some combination of all these factors: economic pressure, safety concerns, liability risks, cultural transformation, and yes, possibly specific incidents or near disasters that haven't been publicly documented. History is rarely simple enough to reduce to a single explanation. What we're left with is absence. A massive empty space in Chicago's history and geography where something enormous used to exist. And in that absence, we project our own interpretations, our own needs to make sense of loss and change. Some people need to believe Riverview closed for purely rational business reasons, because that's emotionally manageable. It wasn't anyone's fault, just economics, just progress. Some people need to believe there were darker reasons, cover-ups and secrets, because that gives meaning to the loss. It wasn't random. It was the result of specific choices and actions that could have been different. Some people need to believe the place is literally haunted, because that keeps it alive in some form, refuses to let it be completely erased. All of these needs are valid responses to a traumatic collective loss. And the truth is probably that Riverview's closure contained elements that would satisfy all these interpretations to some degree. But what's undeniable is the gap between the official story and the emotional reality. The official story is clean and simple, real estate economics. The emotional reality is messy and complicated, a beloved place with a dangerous history that ended suddenly for reasons that were never fully explained, leaving questions that can never be completely answered because too much time has passed and too much evidence has been destroyed. That gap, that space between official narrative and felt truth, is where stories like this live. It's where urban legends are born, where hauntings take hold, where historical mysteries resist resolution. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe Riverview should remain partially mysterious, partially unknowable, because that's truer to what it actually was. A place of thrills and dangers, of joy and trauma, of memories that are both treasured and troubled. The land where it stood continues to resist easy categorization or successful development. It's not haunted in any literal sense, but it's certainly marked by its history in ways that can't be completely erased or paved over. And in Chicago's collective memory, Riverview persists as something more than just a closed amusement park. It's become a symbol of loss, of change, of the way things that seem permanent can disappear overnight. It's a reminder that official explanations don't always capture the full truth. That absence can be as powerful as presence. That some questions remain open no matter how much time passes. The dark story behind Riverview isn't a single revelation or scandal. It's the accumulation of small compromises, deferred decisions, risks that were taken and sometimes paid for, and ultimately the choice to end something suddenly and completely, rather than let it fade gradually or transform into something unrecognizable. It's the story of how we deal with dangerous joys, how we balance thrill-seeking with safety, how we decide what to preserve and what to erase from our collective history. And it's the story of how absence, how the sudden removal of something that was woven into the fabric of millions of lives can create a wound that never quite heals, a question that never quite gets answered, a space that never quite gets filled. Riverview is gone, but the questions it left behind, the gap between what we were told and what we sense might be true, those remain. And maybe that's the real haunting. Not ghosts in any literal sense, but the persistence of unanswered questions, the weight of erased history, the feeling that something important happened that we don't fully understand. That feeling, more than any specific fact or revelation, is what keeps the story of Riverview alive 58 years after the gates closed for the final time. And it's what makes it worth examining, worth questioning, worth refusing to accept the simple official narrative when the evidence suggests something more complicated underneath. Because the truth matters, even when it's incomplete, especially when it's incomplete. The gaps in the story are part of the story, the things we don't know, the records that were destroyed. The questions that can't be answered are all data points that tell us something about what really happened and why. And what they tell us is that Riverview's sudden death wasn't quite as simple as a business decision about real estate values. It was something more urgent, more complicated, more human than that. It was about risk and liability, safety and negligence, the impossibility of preserving something whose essential nature was incompatible with the emerging modern world. It was about choosing erasure over explanation, demolition over documentation, official narrative over messy truth. And in the end, it was about leaving behind more questions than answers, ensuring that those of us who came after would be left wondering what really happened during those final days. What decisions were made and why? What secrets went into the ground along with the foundations of all those rides? The dark story behind Riverview is that we'll never know the full story, and that uncertainty, that permanent gap in our knowledge, might be the most unsettling thing of all.